Tonight on KQED Newsroom, how California is responding to Governor Newsom's sudden orders to begin reopening the state, and the buzz around San Francisco as the school board decides to rename 44 schools in the name of social justice. Also, Tahoe with no snow for skiing. We talk with a climate change expert about a stunning new prediction, and with the Tahoe Conservancy about what they're doing to preserve the region. Plus, a look at California's coastline as this week's take on something beautiful. Welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Priya David Clemens. The week began with a case of whiplash in California as Governor Gavin Newsom unexpectedly reversed course and lifted the strict statewide stay-at-home order. Once again, we can dine outdoors, gather with a few friends, and even get a manicure. Governor Newsom's reopening announcement at a press conference Monday took many by surprise. Still, it's welcome news to the thousands of restaurants and small businesses that have been struggling to stay afloat. The governor said he lifted the order because ICU capacity and infection rates are all trending in positive directions. Meanwhile, the state's rollout of the coronavirus vaccine continues to be somewhat rocky. Switching to prioritizing age over occupation has significant implications for California's goal of equitable vaccine distribution. To chew on this week's big political stories, I'm joined now via Skype from Oakland by San Francisco Chronicle senior political writer Joe Garofoli and KQED politics and government correspondent Marisa Lagos. She joins us via Skype from San Francisco. Thank you both for joining us. Governor Newsom's decision to reopen California took us all by surprise. What was behind this sudden turnaround? Marisa.
I think some of it was obviously political pressure. He's been getting basically incoming from all sides, so much concern fairly among small businesses and others who are really struggling, and the numbers are going down. We have seen that spike that really, hit a peak nationally in early January does seem to be subsiding. Hospitals are no longer thinking about things like rationing care. So I would guess it's a combination of the data and the political pressure, and the fact that, as we might get into, Newsom is now facing the possibility of a recall, and I think is really watching his back around a lot of these things.
All right. And Joe, there was a lot of pressure from the Restaurant Association as well, and from a lawsuit that was just filed by Wine Country Restaurants that we talked about here last week. Are those also playing into this decision?
Oh, sure. All these things are playing into this decision. The Californians are economically hurting right now. With so many people are out of work, the state unemployment rate's about 10%, which is double than what it was about a year ago. But I think that some of the politics, as Marisa alluded to, are going to hurt Newsom here because a lot of legislators were caught by surprise by this. Evan Lowe said that he found out from his constituents. Other people said they found out from the governor's press release. And if Newsom is going to be facing a recall, and it looks increasingly like he may, he's going to need all the Democrats behind him. He doesn't want to be picking off anybody right now.
And so we are looking at a recall effort that's gathering steam against Governor Newsom. Let's talk a little bit about some of the potential Republican challengers who are out there. We've got Chamath Palihapitiya and Kevin Faulconer. What can you tell us about both of these gentlemen? Let's start with Chamath.
Well, he is a Silicon Valley tech executive, I think very much in the vein of previous folks we've seen run for office. You'll remember Neil Kashkari challenging Jerry Brown, Meg Whitman also challenging Jerry Brown, Carly Fiorina running for Senate. I mean, this is not an unusual thing, right? To see somebody step in and say, hey, I did well in business, I could take that into government. He has some interesting ideas that I look forward to as a reporter, kind of digging into, like this idea that we could eliminate state income tax and still increase school funding. A little confusing to me, but we'll see. And then, of course, Kevin Faulconer, San Diego mayor, more moderate Republican, really historically tried to distance himself from Trump. And he's expected, regardless of this recall, to challenge Newsom in 2022. As Joe can get into, the numbers are not on Republican side, so a recall may actually be a better opportunity for them than an actual normal election.
Yeah, Joe, I mean, Republicans have been locked out of the California governor's office for a very long time. Do you think there's a chance of that changing?
Well, what the Republicans don't have right now is a guy named Arnold Schwarzenegger. That's someone with 100% name recognition who can self-fund his campaign to a certain extent. Absent that, you can say, yeah, Newsom's terrible, but so who are we going to replace him with? If you look back at the recall in 2003 when Schwarzenegger was elected, that was a 2-month-long process. You need to have someone who can have name recognition, who can explain what they're all about and who they are in a very huge sprint. And remember, this is going to be, it's not going to be just a couple of people running. There's going to be hundreds and hundreds of people running because the bar is so low. It's going to be a circus. And so to stand out among the circus as a legit candidate, you're going to need someone with some name recognition or someone who has the money to gain some name recognition.
Well, one of the other criticisms was that Newsom had not been releasing coronavirus data. The state did release that data, and I'm hopeful that analysts are pouring through that right now, and we'll be seeing some more information about what it all says. But bottom line, does this sudden reopening help or hurt Gavin Newsom politically? Marisa?
I mean, I think all of this depends on what happens in the next few months. If we're in a situation by this summer where most Californians are vaccinated, where schools are on track to reopen fully in the fall, where the economy is coming back, I don't think this recall stands a great chance. I think a lot of the tensions we're seeing that Joe mentioned between, Democrats in the legislature and Newsom are not as serious as they, folks on the other side might hope. I think a lot of those people were annoyed by him, but maybe are not yet ready to say run against him the way we saw someone like Cruz Bustamante do in the recall against Gray Davis. So I really do think how he handles the coming months is going to be important. And I also think it's important to note that even with all this criticism, even with, to be fair, the really challenging hand Newsom has been dealt, I think that we need to acknowledge that this has been a year like no other. Jerry Brown's up in Calusa, probably breathing a sigh of relief. Newsom's numbers in terms of popularity and support are way higher than Gray Davis's were when we went into that recall. And in general, I think some people are really mad, but I think a lot of those things are really situational and related to the pandemic.
All right. Joe, anything else you want to add? Yeah, before we move on.
This week, we're going to have a big poll coming out this week that will talk about Newsom's popularity, his approval rating. That is going to go a long way to seeing which way this could go.
All right. Well, Joe, let's talk about our new Secretary of State, Shirley Weber. What can you tell us about her?
She's a member of the legislature. She is a longtime advocate for racial justice. She was behind one of the ballot measures this year. And she's been a very popular nominee of Newsom's because, a lot of people were hoping that a black woman would be nominated to replace Kamala Harris. And so he nominated her to fill this position. But still, many advocates for black women will say, like, well, wait a minute. We needed to replace Kamala Harris. There are no black women in the Senate. There's only, I think, 24 of the 140 some women who are in Congress are black women. So there's still pressure on him to name a black woman to the next big appointment he has, which is the Attorney General's position that is very likely to be vacated by Javier Becerra when he becomes the head of Health and Human Services in Washington, D.C.
All right. Marisa, anything you want to add about Shirley Weber, please do. But then I also want to move on to the AG's office and the jockeying that may be going on for the Attorney General position that was vacated by Javier Becerra, who went to join the Biden administration.
Yeah, I'll just say on Shirley Weber, I mean, she is a remarkable woman. The daughter of sharecroppers. Her dad actually fled the South because he was essentially being hunted down by white farmers who felt like he hadn't given them enough of his crop. She went on to get a PhD. She was a professor for a long time. Just an incredible life story. We actually had her on our podcast last year. Go listen to it. But she's really, I think, indicative of the type of person who, sort of has been able to rise above where she started in just in an enormous way. And her daughter is now actually thinking about running for the seat. In terms of AG, I think, Joe hits on a really important thing, which is there is this question of identity politics. And I think that there's good reason for it. Kamala Harris leaving the Senate leaves not a single black woman in that chamber. So I do think that Newsom, there's a lot of people who would like to see a woman appointed as AG, a woman of color. I am hearing that the kind of finalists include Sacramento Mayor Darrell Steinberg, who of course has, run for office many times. That's a big concern. You need someone who can win if you're going to put them in there. I know Rob Bonta, Assemblyman from Oakland, there's a lot of people really pushing for his appointment. But we're just going to have to see, what kind of considerations Newsom makes. I would imagine with a recall being mounted that he would like somebody in that job that he can really trust. And I do know that I've heard Speaker Pelosi is pushing hard for Adam Schiff. Another white guy, but from Los Angeles. And, Pelosi certainly holds a lot of sway in California.
Joe, I can see you've got something you want to share.
I have, I don't think, from what I hear from Schiff's people, that he's not interested in that job. He's, he doesn't want to come back for that job. He feels like he has a better position in Washington. I would think that I put my money on Bonta for a couple of reasons. One of them being that he's a favorite of organized labor. And Newsom is going to need the help of organized labor helping him in this recall, if indeed it is there. So he may want to tap Bonta for that reason, among others. Bonta would also be the first Filipino attorney general in California's history as well.
All right. Well, Marisa, you mentioned your podcast, Political Breakdown. Joe, you had a special guest on your podcast this week. Tell us about Senator Alex Padilla. What surprised you?
Yes, as Marisa can tell you, Alex Padilla, not known as a dynamic personality. He is a very measured type of individual. He's a trained scientist. He went to MIT. He was an aerospace engineer. He worked as a software programmer for a while. But he got very emotional on the podcast. It's the first person to ever kind of break down and, emotionally, like cry a little bit on the podcast, because when he's talked about his parents are Mexican immigrants. He has lived their experience like no other member of the Senate. He talked about waiting in line for them as they got their green card application, renewing their green card. And he talked about his dad, and his dad, how he was a line cook for many years and how he lost his job. And so he is going to be representing their story. And the stories of many other immigrants in California, like no other person could. Kamala Harris, of course, her parents were also immigrants. They were academic. They were PhD students, and so a different type of immigrant. And it's I thought it was an interesting, different side of Alex Padilla, and I think people get to know him a little bit better on that.
All right. Well, I don't know if he's going to cry next week, but he is scheduled to be here. So if you want to see more of our newest state senator, come on back to KQED Newsroom next week. Now that I have that plug in, we have just a little bit of time to finish up with a in San Francisco only story. 44 schools have been renamed, and this process was a political process, and it's really about social justice. Marisa, can you tell us how this renaming is having a fallout across California and across the nation?
Yeah, the New York Times headline was liberals versus liberals. And I'm like, yeah, that's always what it is in San Francisco. I mean, to your point, this is really an attempt to erase from these schools names of people who were slave owners, who, were, who like Junipero Serra, the school up the street from my house, who really did horrible things to Native Americans. But they also included people like Dianne Feinstein. I think the biggest controversy here, not nationally, is just the fact that they're doing this while schools are still closed, while all of us who are parents are still struggling to teach our kids. I think they would say we can walk and chew gum at the same time. And I think most of us who have kids in schools would say, then show us that you can do that.
Yeah, because you're only doing one of those two right now. The schools are still shut. All right, Marisa Lagos with KQED, Joe Garofoli with the San Francisco Chronicle. Thank you both for your time.
Thanks for you.
It has been a wet week with rain around the Bay Area and snow falling in the Lake Tahoe region. But at the Operation Sierra Storm Conference, a gathering of climate scientists and meteorologists that took place in South Lake Tahoe this week, there was a bleak prediction that climate change could mean these snowy mountains and ski slopes could be gone in several decades. Joining us now by Skype are two experts who presented at the conference, climate scientist Dr. Daniel Swain with UCLA's Institute of the Environment and Sustainability, who joins us from Boulder, Colorado, and acting deputy director of the California Tahoe Conservancy, Dorian Fougere, joining us from South Lake Tahoe, both joining us by Skype. Thank you both, gentlemen. Dorian, you're there in Tahoe right now. How much snow did you get this week?
I'm right here at the lake level, about 4 feet or so. It's overtopping the guardrail here on my deck, and then I have some friends around the lake even more. So it's quite a bit of variation, and the mountaintops must be gargantuan.
And Dorian, there's a prediction that with current projections, we're looking at a future that may not have so much snow in Tahoe. Can you tell us a little bit about where that research came from?
That research came from a group of scientists, including University of California at Davis, that looked at climate model projections. That projection is under the most intense greenhouse gas emissions scenario, and it found that snow would not regularly occur at 9,500 feet or above, which would affect a lot of the resorts. That's, of course, if we don't do anything about climate change, so it does require some caveat.
Daniel, with current projections, with the knowledge that you have, how solid is this data and what does that timeline look like?
Well, we know that already the snowpack in the Sierra Nevada and really throughout the American West has started to decline as a result of the warming that's already occurred. And because we do expect there to be a significant amount of additional warming in the future, even if we take aggressive climate mitigation measures, there is going to be a further loss of snowpack. And under medium or high warming scenarios, which could still happen depending on what we choose to do over the next few decades, that loss of snowpack could be quite profound. At certain elevations, could mean that the typical condition in winter is rain rather than snow, up at 5, 6, or even 7,000 feet in some cases, where snow fell quite regularly during the historical period.
And so, Dorian, what does this prediction mean for the Tahoe region?
It means we need to keep conducting some of the planning that we're doing and really investing now in changing for the future and adapting. For the resorts, if those predictions come true, you'll see green slopes in the winter instead of white slopes, and potentially a green lake and more burn scars in the forest and so forth. So it could be significant, but we're also having a lot of partnerships here exactly to start getting a handle on these issues.
Okay, well, I'm looking forward to the part of our discussion when we get to solutions. But for now, let's talk about some continuing problems with this increasing warming and the reduced snowpack. Daniel, let's talk about how that's going to impact our water availability here in California and potential flooding.
Well, California's water systems are really strongly conditioned on the presence of a pretty robust Sierra Nevada snowpack. Most of our major reservoirs drain watersheds that receive a significant fraction of their annual precipitation, at least historically, as snow. And why that matters is the precipitation that falls as snow doesn't melt immediately. It usually doesn't melt in winter. It waits until spring or even summer at the higher elevations to melt. And our reservoir system is contingent on that gradual snowmelt throughout the dry season, which California has such a profound summer dry season just about every year. It's very convenient to have this time-released water storage essentially coming out of that snowpack as we have historically. But as we start to lose that snowpack in a warming climate, that time-released water storage becomes less reliable and less able to replenish our reservoirs during the dry season. So it means we have less carryover capacity and potentially less drought and dry season resilience if we lose that snowpack. And then, of course, there are implications far beyond California's urban water systems. Also, the ecology of California. You know, if you're a tree in the forest, you don't benefit from water behind a reservoir anyway. So if you're losing that snowpack earlier in the year, it's melting earlier, it's not replenishing the soil moisture out there on the landscape during fire season. And that's one of the reasons, especially in the mountains, why we're seeing an increase in wildfire severity in this part of the world.
Daniel, you've also spoken about concerns with flooding in the future, and in particular what the people who put together the Great California Earthquake Shakeout program call the other big one. Can you tell me about that?
One of the big concerns in a warming climate in California, and even though we focus a lot on water scarcity and drought and wildfire, understandably because we've seen a lot of those recently, the other side of the coin is the increased risk of flood as we see more intense storms and, as we've been talking about today, a greater fraction of precipitation occurring as rain rather than snow, which runs off immediately into rivers, lakes, and streams and causes higher flood pulses. So in a warming climate, we sort of have this double whammy effect where there may be more precipitation overall during individual storm events, and also a greater fraction of that precipitation immediately turning into potential floodwater. Both of those are pretty important contributors to future flood risk in this part of the world.
Dorian, one of your major projects is the Upper Truckee Marsh restoration. What's the connection between that project and climate change?
The Upper Truckee River and marsh are the most important and largest watershed for the Lake Tahoe Basin. So when we think about the lake's blue clarity, it's really important to filter nutrients and also to ensure that we have a healthy ecosystem. A lot of that restoration work is removing historical development. And in terms of climate change, that means that our groundwater systems will be more resilient, means that we'll have refugia and areas for sensitive plants and birds to persist even under climate change, and basically have much more resilient ecosystems for some of these changes.
And Daniel, it's only January. We've already seen wildfires break out in California. Is this what we should expect going forward?
The good news is I don't think winter wildfires will necessarily become a regular occurrence. They may become more possible than they were historically, simply because we have warmer and drier starts to the rainy season, so that fire season may persist longer in what was historically the wet season and into winter. There's also potentially a silver lining there, though. It may actually mean that there are more opportunities to do prescribed fire treatments in high-risk fire zones in some parts of California if we maintain those dry conditions in some years at least into the winter when it's a little bit safer to do them. So that's one potential silver lining to the extension of the very end of fire season into early winter, at least in some years.
And Dorian, how's the Tahoe region preparing for increased wildfires?
We're doing an extraordinary amount. For the past 15 or so years since the Angora fire in 2007, there's a very large partnership where we're actively managing all the fuels in the wildland-urban interface and around neighborhoods, and also taking a much larger landscape approach to really doing much more efficient forest restoration that also reduces fire danger, including through prescribed burning, like Daniel mentioned. So quite a variety of partnerships here, given the amount of property at stake and public health and safety as well.
Daniel, I want to talk a little bit about the change in seasonality here, because it seems like our seasons are really going to be shifting. Can you talk us through how that change is going to look?
Well, something that we've seen already in California are what are effectively becoming warmer, drier summers. Our summers are already dry from a precipitation perspective. It doesn't rain very often in coastal California during the summer, as I think most viewers are probably well aware. But that shoulder season in the autumn is really important. At some point in the autumn, typically you start to see precipitation in Northern California that eventually spreads south. And that largely dictates the end of fire season, the end of the long, dry summer. And what we're seeing recently is that that long, dry summer is becoming even longer, extending into the autumn. So we're seeing less precipitation in autumn, much warmer temperatures in summer and autumn. And the net result of this is a longer fire season, a more intense fire season, and a shorter but potentially sharper rainy season. So we're sort of constraining the months during which we receive most of our precipitation to an even narrower window than we were used to historically. And we've started to see the early signs of this in the real world, and it's consistent with what climate projections show for the future of California. Less precipitation in the shoulder seasons, warmer all year round, with a shorter but sharper rainy season in those core winter months.
Dorian, is there any piece of that you are most concerned about? Are there months coming that you think, oh boy, February's are going to be tough, or, we're going to be worrying about wildfire more than we ever have? Which piece of all of this do you worry about the most?
Probably the lake itself. Certainly we're nervous all throughout the fire season, and it's become much longer than usual, and we have smoke impacts from outside the basin, inside the basin, and people seeking refuge in Tahoe with the clean air. But the lake itself, the famous Keep Tahoe Blue and the blue clarity, the reason why people come to this largest alpine lake, that itself is impacted by these longer summers and the warming winter temperatures, because historically the hot water on the top of the lake would descend during the winter and mix, and that's a really important ecological process for the lake to have that clarity. So we are doing everything we can through our partnerships and stormwater measures and biological studies to really figure out everything we can do to keep Tahoe blue.
Daniel, I'm sure sometimes it can feel like you are a messenger of doom and gloom. Do you have some words of hope? What can people do to prevent this outcome?
Yeah, as a climate scientist, often the news we get to deliver is more often than not bad news rather than good news. But I do think there are some important silver linings. Really, the overarching message that I want to leave folks with is that even in the face of increasingly extreme climate conditions, that doesn't mean that increasing climate disasters are inevitable. So hopefully The goal is that we can decouple some of these physical extremes from the negative impacts they have on humans and the environment. And there's a couple of specific examples of this. With respect to wildfire, for example, one of the most promising management tools we have in a lot of regions is, believe it or not, fighting fire with fire, literally using prescribed or managed burns to reduce the risk of fire by bringing fire regimes closer to their natural pattern of more frequent lower to medium intensity burns. From a flood management perspective, you might even be able to apply sort of a similar approach, except that in this case, you might fight flood with drought and drought with flood. And by that, I mean we may be able to reduce the risk that from floods that do occur by recharging our groundwater with those floodwaters, redirecting those floodwaters into areas that are strategically selected to help us out with recharging our underground aquifers.
Dorian, is there specific behavioral change you'd like to see in people when they come to Tahoe?
The one thing I would say is just treat it like your front yard. You know, Tahoe is the crown jewel of the Sierra Nevada. We have 24 million annual visitors. We have about a $6 billion recreation economy. And if we think about it, there are ways that we can stem the worst impacts of climate change and also avoid Tahoe being loved to death. You know, sometimes people come here and maybe treat it like a little bit more urban of an area where there are lots of services to keep the place clean, but it's really up to everyone that comes here to love Tahoe just as much as the residents do and help us all keep that beauty there for everyone to enjoy.
Okay. Dorian Fougere with the California Tahoe Conservancy, Dr. Daniel Swain with UCLA. Thank you for your time.
Thanks again for having me.
Moving from the mountains to the ocean now. California's coastline stretches for hundreds of miles along the western edge of the United States. Videographer Jim McKee captured just a portion of its splendor for this week's look at something beautiful. I'm Priya David Clemens. You can reach me on Twitter at Priya D. Clemens. And you can find more of our news coverage at kqed.org/kqed-newsroom. From all of us here at KQED Newsroom, thank you for joining us. Good night.